The seaside mansion was silent in the darkness, with only the dim glow of the far-off lighthouse sweeping across the large windows and casting shifting shadows on the walls. Mila felt as though she were being swallowed by the emptiness outside as the waves roared against the cliffs, mirroring the turmoil brewing inside her. She gripped her phone tightly, its screen still lit with the last message from an unknown number. "You don't know where you are, be careful." Her hands trembled slightly, and her throat felt dry, but MAA couldn't tell if this was anger or fear. The lighthouse beam briefly flashed again, illuminating the room and revealing a shadowy figure standing silently in the corner. Her heart froze. Someone was observing her, and she wanted to scream, but the sound remained trapped in her throat, refusing to escape. Adrian's face appeared in the dim light, sharp and unreadable, his gaze heavy and cold like the night outside. He didn't say a word, just stared at her with an intensity Mila couldn't tell if it was anger or a warning. "What are you doing here, Mila?" She managed to say, her voice, barely louder than a whisper, and it dissolved into the oppressive silence of the room. The figure didn't respond. Instead, they stepped out of the shadows slowly and deliberately. "The better question is, what are you doing here, MAA Adrian?" As she struggles to maintain a calm voice, but her tone betrays her dread. Adrian took another step forward, his piercing gaze seemingly cutting through every thought in her head. "I warned you," he continued, each word slicing through the air like a blade. "Do you even realize what you've gotten yourself into?" he asked in a low, cutting voice. She opened her mouth to respond but was unable to find the right words. "Don't trust Lucas so easily." "What are you referring to, Rose?" The bewilderment in her chest is turning into a frank fear of what Lucas has done. Adrian didn't answer right away. He studied her for what felt like an eternity, his eyes brimming with unspoken truths. "There are things," he said, his voice dropping to an almost whisper, "that you'll wish you never knew." Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Mila alone with 1,000 unanswered questions spinning wildly in her mind. The darkness swallowed the room once again, broken only by the steady crashing of the waves like a distant and ominous warning. Mila stood motionless, her breath shallow and uneven. She knew in that moment that everything was about to change, and there was no going back. Mila sat quietly on the wooden chair on the porch, her eyes fixed on the vast expanse of the ocean. The soft morning sunlight bathed the white sands below, but within her a weight lingered that she could neither name nor shake. Adrian's words from the night before echoed relentlessly in her mind. "There are things you'll wish you never knew." He had spoken to them like a warning, but his eyes, brimming with pain and resentment, told a story far larger than what he had dared to tell. She thought back to the day she first set foot in the mansion, an architectural marvel perched against the sea, its grandeur masking invisible cracks. Nathan had always been the picture of charm and control, presenting himself as the strong and caring patriarch, but Mila had quickly noticed the tension in the air, particularly in the eyes of Adrian and Lucas. There was something unspoken lingering between them, a secret hovering like a shadow over the family. Lucas had been the first to break the ice, his cheerful demeanor and easygoing nature pulling Mila into his orbit. Yet the more she spent time with Lucas, the more she realized he only ever told half of his stories. Once, while recounting the tough years after his mother's passing, his words trailed off. "Adrian was always the one holding everything together," Lucas had said with a faint smile through his eyes, carrying a heaviness Mila couldn't ignore. "He's always felt like it's his job to take on all the responsibility, but sometimes he's too rigid." MAA didn't pry further, but the comment left her wondering what had turned Adrian into the guarded, distant figure he was now. Why did he always seem cold, even hostile, toward her when she had done nothing to provoke it? One evening, when Nathan was away on one of his long business trips, her curiosity deepened. Mila overheard a heated argument between Adrian and Lucas in the living room. She hadn't intended to eavesdrop, but Lucas's raised voice had drawn her attention. "You're always like this," Adrian. Lucas shouted. "You think you're the only one who knows what's right and wrong, but you don't understand anything. All you do is control, and you think you understand." Adrian shot back, his tone cold and cutting. "You've always lived in your own little world, Luke, always leaving others to clean up after you. Know it's not my fault she's gone." Lucas's voice cracked, trembling with raw emotion. "I'm not the reason she left us." MAA froze. Her heart tightened as though caught in a vice. She wanted to walk away, but her legs felt rooted to the floor. The argument didn't just hint at their pain. It opened a door into the fractured past of this family. A wound neither brother had ever healed. From a few days later, Mila received an answer to a question she hadn't even dared to ask. Adrian approached her in the kitchen one quiet afternoon, his face unreadable as he sat down across from her. For a long moment he didn't speak, and the silence between them grew heavier with each passing second. "Our mother died in a car accident," he finally said, his voice devoid of emotion, as though he were recounting someone else's story. "She was driving home after me, meeting someone who wasn't our father. Everyone called it an accident, but I knew better." She'd been trying to leave for a long time. Mila's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know how to respond to the starkness of his confession. "Nathan didn't know about this?" she asked softly. Adrian's dark eyes met hers, steady and unflinching. "I don't know if he did or not, but he always acted as if everything was fine. And when he brought you here, I couldn't help but wonder if he was trying to do the same thing all over again." A chill ran down Mila's spine. "What do you mean by that?" As days turned into weeks, Mila realized that this house wasn't just a place to live. It was a repository of hidden truths, and that Evelyn, Lucas's close friend, who seemed to appear more frequently than Mila felt comfortable with, wasn't as innocent as she pretended to be. Her presence was like a needle pricking at the fabric of Mila's unease. Her remarks were always veiled, her observations far too sharp. One day, Evelyn let something slip during a conversation. "You know, Mila," she said with a sly smile. Mila said in a cautious tone, "What are you talking about?" "This family has a way of defending itself. They will exclude anyone they perceive as an outsider." Evelyn only grinned, her face inscrutable. "Oh, nothing, just an observation." The cryptic comment left Mila spiraling into doubt. Had she walked into a place where she was never truly welcome? And if so, what secrets were these people are trying so desperately to hide? The tension in the house, that it grew unbearable. Adrian's vague warnings, Lucas's uncomfortably close gestures of affection, and Evelyn's insinuations all began to close in on Mila, suffocating her with questions she didn't know how to answer. She felt as though she were being drawn into the center of a web she couldn't escape from, and then came the moment that changed everything, a moment that would force every hidden truth to the surface, shattering the fragile balance this family had clung to for so long. Mila didn't know it yet, but she was about to face the darkest chapter of their story, and her own. That night, the mansion was suffocatingly silent. Mila sat alone in the living room, a glass of red wine swirling in her hand, catching the dim light of a single table lamp. Nathan hadn't yet returned from his long business trip. Adrian had locked himself in his room earlier that evening, showing no sign of emerging from the vast house, which was filled only with the faint whisper of the wind slipping through cracks in the windows, like an ominous warning lingering in the air. Mila felt an inexplicable emptiness, as though every emotion within her had been pulled into a bottomless void. Lucas appeared suddenly at the top of the staircase, his disheveled hair and flushed face illuminated in the faint glow. He wore a simple white t-shirt and faded jeans that hung loosely on his movements, casual yet deliberate. "You're still up?" he asked, his voice as warm and low as always, though something in his gaze unsettled her, a subtle unease, a flicker of something she couldn't name. "Couldn't sleep," Mila replied, her voice soft but dry. "Lucas, how about you?" He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he approached her slowly and sat in the chair opposite her, his gaze fixed on the glass in her hand as he watched the wine sway. "Mila, don't you think we should talk?" "It's just you and me, with Nathan not present and Adrian locked away as usual." Leaning forward, Lucas's gaze unwavering. "About you, me, and whatever's going on in this house," made Mila's heart race, though she couldn't tell if it was from fear or something else entirely. Mila tightened her grip on the glass, trying to keep her composure, but her trembling fingers betrayed her. "Talk about what?" she asked, shielding her eyes from his. "Do you have a sense of belonging?" he said. "This place isn't for you, Mila. You don't fit, but you make me feel something I can't ignore." Mila drew in a shaky breath, trying to steady herself. "Lucas, what are you talking about?" In a deep, weighted voice that I could tell from the time you stepped in. "I don't understand." Lucas let out a small, bitter laugh. Not one of amusement, but one filled with conflict. "You understand, Mila." With that, Adrian turned and walked away. His footsteps faded up the stairs. The room fell silent once more, the suffocating stillness returning. Lucas turned back to Mila, his expression a mixture of regret and sadness. "I'm sorry," he whispered. But Mila couldn't bring herself to reply. She stood frozen, her chest tight with the weight of what had just transpired. As the night deepened, Mila lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling. Her mind was a tangled mess of emotions and thoughts she couldn't untangle. She knew deep down that something had shifted irrevocably. A line had been crossed, and nothing would ever be the same again. But what she didn't realize was that this moment, as harrowing as it was merely the prelude to the storm that was about to engulf them all. The house, already quiet, now felt suffocatingly heavy, as if every breath carried the weight of an impending storm. The morning after, Mila woke with tired eyes and a growing unease that clung to her chest like a shadow. She couldn't shake the memory of the previous night, the closeness with Lucas, the piercing cold stare of Adrian when he saw them. Lucas tried to approach her during breakfast, but Mila avoided him, her body stiff and unyielding. Adrian remained completely silent, retreating into an air of detachment as though nothing had happened. But Mila knew better. This silence wasn't peace. It was the calm before everything erupted. Stepping into the garden to catch her breath, Mila hoped the open air might ease her suffocating anxiety, but Evelyn was already there, leaning casually against the wooden railing. Her sharp eyes seemed to be waiting for Mila, a predator lurking just out of sight. "You seem tense," Evelyn said lightly, her tone carrying the same edge as a blade wrapped in silk. Mila tried to brush past her, but Evelyn didn't move. "What's wrong? What may it be?" "I don't know what you're talking about, Mila," she said, her voice strained but steady. "Oh, you know exactly what I mean. What happened between you and Lucas?" Mila froze, her heart pounding fiercely. She turned to Evelyn, whose eyes gleamed with feline amusement. "I saw you two last night," Evelyn said with a shrug, her smirk growing sinister. "Amazingly, Adrian also witnessed it, didn't he?" Evelyn drew nearer, her gaze sweeping over Mila as though she were removing her barriers one by one. "Do you really believe there won't be repercussions? What are you looking for?" "Nothing at all," Evelyn questioned, her eyes betraying her as her voice trembled with a mixture of caution and worry. "I just think Adrian won't stay quiet for long, and when Nathan gets back, well," she lets the sentence hang in the air, its implications sharper than any explicit threatening. "Things are bound to get interesting." Mila felt her legs rooted to the ground, her body unable to move. Evelyn knew Adrian knew, and if Nathan found out, everything would collapse. Turning abruptly, Mila left without another word, but she could feel Evelyn's gaze boring into her back. No matter how fast she walked, she couldn't outrun the storm that was already building. That evening, the inevitable came to pass. Nathan returned from his business trip, bringing a new energy into the house, though it was anything but calming. He greeted Mila and Lucas with his usual cheer, but Mila couldn't shake the sinking dread pooling in her stomach. Adrian, on the other hand, maintained his stoic detachment, his gaze occasionally flickering to Mila, but he spoke not a single word during dinner. Evelyn made an unexpected appearance. She waltzed into the dining room with a bright smile, her presence immediately altering the atmosphere. Nathan, the gracious host, graciously invited Evelyn to stay, quickly making her the center of attention. However, beneath the light-hearted banter, Mila sensed the venom hidden in every word, and as if on purpose, Evelyn struck Lucas. Her piercing eyes swept over Mila and Lucas, and Mila felt herself shrinking under the scrutiny. "You and Mila seem quite close," she said casually, her voice laced with something Mila couldn't place, but she knew she should fear. The table fell silent. Mila kept her head down, feeling the weight of everyone's gaze on her. "Are we just siblings?" Lucas replied, his tone steady through a faint crack in his composure. It really betrayed him. Evelyn raised an eyebrow, her smile turning razor-sharp. "I could have sworn you two seemed closer than that." Nathan set his glass down, his sharp eyes shifting from Evelyn to Lucas. "Evelyn," he said, his voice low, warning, "what are you insinuating?" "Oh, nothing at all, Evelyn," she replied sweetly, but her gaze shifted to Adrian. "I just thought Adrian might have something to add." Adrian, who had been silent throughout dinner, finally raised his head. His eyes were hard, weary, and full of unspoken truths. "Enough," Evelyn said, her voice a cold command. "Don't turn this into one of your games." "Games?" Evelyn chuckled. Her laugh was soft and cutting. "Oh, Adrian, I think this is far from a game, this is the truth." Nathan's gaze darted around the table, his confusion turning to suspicion. "Would someone please tell me? What is going on?" he demanded, his voice steady but brimming with tension, and silence enveloped the room. Mila felt as though the walls were closing in on her, the air too thick to breathe. Before she could muster the courage to speak, Adrian pushed back his chair and stood. "Lucas and Mila," he said, his voice deliberate and weighted. He fixed his gaze on Nathan. They never should have. Adrian's words detonated explosively at the table. Nathan turned to Lucas and Mila, his face a mixture of shock and growing fury. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice low and hoarse. Lucas opened his mouth to explain, but Nathan slammed his hand on the table. "Doesn't say another word," he roared, his voice trembling with anger. "I can't believe this." Mila sat frozen with guilt gripping her like a vice, her lips parted, but before she could speak, Evelyn laughed, a sharp, triumphant sound that sent chills down Mila's spine. "Oh, this is the most entertaining family I've ever known," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with mockery. "Nathan, do you see now why things will never be right?" "Get out," Nathan snapped. His voice was icy. "Get out of my house, Evelyn." Evelyn shrugged, unfazed as she rose to leave. She cast one last glance at Mila. Her smile dripped with malice. "Good luck, dear," she said softly before disappearing through the door. The silence that followed her departure was deafening. Nathan turned to Lucas, then Mila, his eyes blazing with hurt and rage. Both of them said, his voice shaking, "I want the truth." Truthfully, neither of them spoke. Mila bowed her head, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't bring herself to say anything. She knew that whatever she said, it wouldn't change the reality they now faced. A line had been crossed, and from this moment on, there was no turning back. The house, already steeped in silence, now seemed completely frozen in time. After the explosive confrontation, Mila had left early that morning. But the heavy tension lingered, clinging to the air like an unshakable weight. Lucas sat alone in the dimly lit living room, his blank stare fixed on the window where the soft hues of twilight streamed in and out on the balcony. Adrian stood motionless, a cigarette between his fingers, unlit. His gaze was distant, lost in thoughts that seemed to spiral endlessly. Nathan, since Mila's departure, had not spoken a word. He had confined himself to his study, burying himself in books and documents as though they were the only things holding him together. Evelyn had vanished the night before, leaving behind no trace except the cryptic insinuations that had appended the entire family. But then, just as the quiet stretched into an unbearable void, a letter appeared on the coffee table in the living room, its presence unexplainable as though it had materialized out of nowhere. Lucas was the first to notice it. He reached for it, his hands trembling as he had confined himself to his study. Burying himself in books and documents, as though they were the only things holding him together, Evelyn had vanished the night before, leaving behind no trace except the cryptic insinuations that had appended the entire family. But then, just as the quiet stretched into an unbearable void, a letter appeared on the coffee table in the living room, its presence unexplainable as though it had materialized out of nowhere. Lucas was the first to notice it. He reached for it, his hands trembling as he recognized the unmistakable handwriting on the envelope, Evelyn's. "What the hell is this?" murmured, breaking the suffocating silence. Adrian stepped in from the balcony, his eyes narrowing as they fell on the envelope in Lucas's hands. "Open it," he said, his voice cold but laced with tension. Lucas tore the envelope, pulling out a photograph and a small note. He examined the photo first, and the color drained from his face almost instantly. His hand shook as he held it out to Adrian. It was a picture of Myler, not in the mansion but in a small, simple room, sitting across from their mother, the very woman who had been presumed dead for years. Adrian snatched the photo from his expression, unreadable at first, but then his eyes widened in disbelief. "That this can't be real," he muttered, as if trying to convince himself that what he was seeing wasn't true. Yet the image was unmistakable. Their mother was alive, and the shocking part wasn't just her existence. It was the fact that she was with Mila. Lucas carefully unfolded the note accompanying the photograph, his voice breaking as he read aloud. "Now you understand why Mila came into your lives. Don't you think she's not innocent and you are her? Her mother's sons are destined to bear the consequences." Evelyn, for a moment, no one spoke. The weight of the revelation was too heavy, too unimaginable. Adrian's grip on the photo tightened, creasing the edges as his jaw clenched. Lucas stood abruptly, his eyes blazing with both anger and confusion. "Evelyn's lying. This can't be true," he shouted, his voice echoing off the cold walls of the mansion. Adrian remained quiet, his gaze fixed on the photograph. She's alive, he said finally, his voice low and chilling. Then everything we believed was a lie. Lucas shook his head almost violently as though trying to shake away the implications. Maa doesn't know anything, she can't be involved in this. She just can't, he stammered. Though his own words sounded hollow to his ears, Adrian turned toward the door. His expression hardened. We have to find Mila, he said, his voice sharp with determination. She knows something. And if Evelyn isn't lying, Mila isn't just an outsider who accidentally destroyed this family. She was placed here to do it. In that moment, the fragile foundation of Lucas's feelings for Mila crumbled. Every glance, every touch, every moment they'd shared now felt tainted. Twisted into a nightmare he couldn't escape, he followed Adrian to the car. There was shared urgency fueling the tires as they sped toward the train station where they believed Mila was headed. But when they arrived, she was already gone on the deserted platform. A single piece of paper was taped to one of the waiting benches. Adrian ripped it free, his jaw tightening as he unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakable. In Miller's, this time it read, "I'm sorry for everything. But there are truths that shouldn't be uncovered. Sometimes the truth isn't freedom. It's a burden that will haunt you forever. Don't come after me. This is a path I have to walk alone." Mila, Adrian, and Lucas stood in silence, the note hanging limply in Adrian's hand. The questions swirled violently in their minds, but no answers presented themselves. Their mother, alive, Evelyn, how much did she know? And Mila, the woman who had torn through their family, who was she really? The faint whistle of a departing train broke the silence as the locomotive disappeared into the horizon, taking with it the answers they might never uncover. The platform grew darker as night fell, and the two brothers were left standing there lost in a sea of uncertainty. Lucas turned to Adrian, his voice hoarse. What if she wasn't lying? What if Evelyn was telling the truth? Adrian didn't respond immediately. His cold, calculating gaze scanned the empty tracks as though searching for the answers in the darkness. If she was, he said finally, his tone devoid of emotion, then we've been living in someone else's story, and we don't even know who's writing it. As the shadows deepened around them, both men knew one thing with certainty. Nothing would ever be the same, and though Mila had vanished, she left behind was only beginning.